March 4th, 1944. Berlin, Germany. Dawn broke over the capital in a thin, grey haze, the kind of light that made the world look brittle, as if one hard strike could shatter it. Across Tempelhof airfield, Luftwaffe ground crews were already moving with practiced urgency as the warning sirens began to wail. Telephones rang, officers shouted orders, mechanics yanked chocks from tires, pilots jogged across the frozen tarmac toward their machines, breath hanging in the air like smoke. The message from headquarters was clear. A major American bomber raid was inbound, and Berlin was the target. None of this surprised the German pilots, not anymore. In early 1944, American daylight bombing raids were part of the weekly rhythm of war. The pilots knew the drill. B-17s and B-24s would cross the Dutch coast in massive formations, thundering eastward in 100-plane waves, escorted by fighters that would turn back once they reached their fuel limits. Then, once the little friends disappeared, the German fighters would attack. It wasn't an ideal strategy, but it was predictable. For months, Berlin had been protected by nothing more than distance. No American fighter had the range to fly from England, cross hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, battle over Germany's heartland, and return home. The mathematics of aviation had drawn a firm line in the sky, a line the Americans couldn't cross. German pilots based their entire defense doctrine on that simple fact. So as Oberleutnant Heinz Nowotny climbed into the cockpit of his Bf-109 G6 and strapped himself in, his mind moved automatically through the same expectations as always: climb to altitude, find the bombers, wait for the escorts to peel off, and then dive at the unprotected formations. It had been the rhythm of the air war since 1943. But that morning, routines were about to die. The engines roared to life. One by one, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs taxied out, their tails bouncing slightly over the uneven concrete. The pilots throttled up, rocketing down the runway and lifting into the dull sky. Berlin spread beneath them, wide boulevards, industrial blocks, rail yards, and columns of smoke drifting from chimneys as the city awakened to another day of war. At 20,000 feet, the air thinned and the engines sang higher. The German formation leveled out and turned north. Radio chatter filled their headsets. Ground control reported the bombers already crossing central Germany. The estimated time to intercept was minutes away. Then, the first contrails appeared. Long, white scars slashed across the sky. The Americans were coming, dozens of bombers, then scores, then hundreds, a wall of metal and thunder, heading straight for Berlin. German pilots tightened their oxygen masks and throttled forward. It was time. They approached from above and behind, positioning themselves to pounce when the escorts broke off. Except today, something was wrong. The escorts weren't breaking off. They were climbing. They were maneuvering. And then, impossibly, they turned toward the Germans. Heinz Nowotny blinked, convinced he was misreading the sky. But no, there they were. Sleek silver fighters, with long noses and shining canopies, slicing through the cold air like blades. P-51 Mustangs. Over Berlin, it made no sense. The P-47 Thunderbolt couldn't reach Berlin. Everyone knew that. The P-38 Lightning couldn't reach Berlin either, unless it was a suicide run. The distances had been calculated by engineers, intelligence analysts, and pilots alike. No American fighter based in England had the range to escort bombers deep into the Reich. Germany's entire air defense doctrine was built on that fact. And yet the Mustangs were there, their silver wings gleaming in the sun as they swept down in perfect formation. One German pilot later wrote, "We were stunned. The impossible had happened. American fighters were over the capital. In that moment, we understood that everything had changed." The P-51s closed with the German formation with terrifying speed. They weren't diving from thousands of feet above, burning altitude for energy. They were already at altitude, cruising confidently, their engines running smooth and cool. The Germans barely had time to react before the first Mustang overshot one of the Bf-109s and arced around for another pass. The sky erupted into chaos. Machine gun tracers streaked through the air. Engines screamed at redline. Pilots grunted against G-forces. The German formation shattered as Mustangs tore into them. These weren't bombers limping along in tight defensive cells. These were agile fighters with long legs, high speed, 650s in the wings, and pilots trained to use them. The Germans tried to regroup. It didn't work. Every time a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf turned toward the bomber formation, a Mustang dropped in behind them. Every time a German tried to dive away, a Mustang followed, its Merlin engine howling as it chased them through the clouds. The Germans had never seen anything like it. The P-51 wasn't just present, it was dominating. The battle turned brutal quickly. The Luftwaffe had been hoping for easy kills. Instead, they found themselves in a knife fight with an opponent who finally had reach, altitude, and fuel. By the time the bombers reached Berlin, German casualties were already piling up. Several fighters were falling in flames. Others, running low on fuel after extended combat, had no choice but to disengage. Meanwhile, the Mustangs circled the bomber formations effortlessly, ready to dive on any threat. For the first time in the entire war, the bombers were truly protected, not for part of the mission, not for the trip to the border, but all the way to the heart of Germany. Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, later reflected on that moment with grim clarity. The day the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the war was lost. He wasn't exaggerating. Germany's strategy depended on its fighters being able to strike unescorted bombers. Without that advantage, the Luftwaffe had no means of stopping the American air campaign. And worse, they had to fight Mustangs. Not tired, half-fuel Mustangs at the edge of their range, but Mustangs with drop tanks that gave them over 300 miles of endurance. Mustangs that could fight above Berlin and still make it home. German pilots described the feeling as hopelessness. One recalled, "Our tactics, our planning, our training, all of it assumed the escorts would turn back. Overnight, that assumption was gone." The Germans tried everything. They attempted mass attacks, sending dozens of fighters at once, trying to break through the Mustang curtain. They tried feints, hoping to draw the escorts away. They even attempted high-altitude ambushes. Nothing worked. The Mustangs had the range, the speed, and the altitude advantage. The Luftwaffe's veteran pilots were dwindling, and the replacements were boys, undertrained, underprepared, and terrified. The Mustang was deadly enough, but the bomber offensive was now unstoppable. Oil refineries burned. Aircraft factories were flattened. Ball-bearing plants, the lifeblood of German machinery, were turned to rubble. Synthetic fuel production dropped so low that German pilot training hours collapsed. Some new pilots had fewer than 100 total hours in the cockpit before facing veterans in Mustangs. The results were catastrophic. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train them. Germany wasn't running out of planes. It was running out of men to fly them. Meanwhile, the Mustangs kept coming. over Hamburg, over Leipzig, over Munich, over the Ruhr. Every city, every factory, every airfield the Luftwaffe once thought safe was now within reach of American escorts. The idea of safe distance, the concept that geography could protect targets, evaporated. Nothing was out of range now. When P-51s first appeared over Berlin, it didn't just change a battle, it changed the war. German pilots flying that day never forgot it. The shock, the disbelief, the sinking realization that the air war, the war they'd once dominated, had turned irrevocably against them. One pilot wrote, "It was like seeing the horizon collapse." March 4th, 1944 was the day the Luftwaffe understood that the sky no longer belonged to them. And once Germany lost the skies, everything beneath them, factories, rail lines, fuel plants, tank production, troop movements, became exposed. The P-51 wasn't just a fighter, it was the weapon that unlocked the collapse of German air power. By the time Berlin fell in 1945, the sight of Mustangs roaming through German airspace was no longer shocking. It was normal, expected, routine. But on March 4th, 1944, it was a revelation, a death sentence for a strategy that had once been the pride of the Luftwaffe. It was the day German pilots looked up at the sky over their own capital, saw the glint of American fighters where no American fighter should ever have been, and knew the truth. They had lost the air war, and once they lost the air war, they had lost the war.